Good morning. Good morning, everyone. My name is Ara Sergiui, and I have the distinct pleasure and privilege of working at Guilford College. As you can tell, our program is being recorded so that we can share the recording of it with you and others who are not able to participate this morning. Let's start with a moment of silence. All right, thank you very much. So this is our third in the series of the last Thursday of the month coffee chat with Guilford College. And our program title is Law Enforcement and Justice or Injustice. As you can probably see, the chat function is limited to participants with the host only. Please use the chat function to ask questions, and we will get to those questions if we have time at the end of the program. Everyone is muted for the purpose of keeping the program as amenable as possible for all the guests. So please continue to stay muted and only use the chat function to ask questions. So at this time, I have the pleasure of introducing my colleague, my friend, Barbara J. Lawrence, who is the Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion and the Title IX Coordinator at Guilford College. She is also an Associate Professor of Justice and Policy Studies, and previously Barbara served as an Associate Academic Dean. Barbara is the founding director of Guilford's Wiser Justice Program. She is chair of the LGBTQ Center Board of the Guilford Green Foundation and serves on the North Carolina Post-Secondary Prison Education Committee. Prior to Guilford College, Barbara worked for the New York City Police Department as an investigator, instructor, and domestic violence unit trainer and investigator. She has worked for both district attorney and public defender offices and currently consults with the Greensboro Police Department and other police agencies throughout the country. Barbara has written for the Hamline Journal of Public Law and Policy, and her research interests include race and criminal justice, juvenile detention policies and incarceration, African American girls and women in prison. Barbara holds a doctorate of jurisprudence from Indiana University School of Law, a master's of public affairs from the IU Purdue University School of Public and Environmental Affairs, and a baccalaureate degree in criminal justice from John Jay College of Criminal Justice. Barbara, welcome to the last Thursday of the month coffee chat with Guilford College. I'm so glad that you are our featured speaker.
Thank you, Ara. Good morning. Thank you. I am honored to be a part of this series. And greetings and welcome to all the participants that are on this call today. So thank you. Happy to be here.
Great. Thank you, Barbara. So last month we saw a gut-wrenching video of George Floyd's horrendous death by a police officer in Minneapolis. And Barbara, the response to it was immediate uproar and outpouring of anger all across the United States and in other parts of the world. What makes this incident different from others before?
Oh my, Ara. I mean, one reason is the egregiousness of the interaction. I mean, we have not seen in decades an officer lean on someone's neck for the world to see. I mean, not only can that obstruct breathing, but that could literally break someone's neck and kill that person. So we haven't seen that. And there were four officers involved in that situation, and they disregarded his cries that he couldn't breathe. I mean, it was such an indifference to human life. And I think that the world saw that, and it brought up just some inherent form of outrage for the world to see. And it resulted in folks all over the world protesting and being publicly outraged. So I think it was the egregiousness of the act, in particular with George Floyd.
Yes, Barbara, it really was egregious. And so, but it's not the first time. This incident appears to have brought up a lot of feelings and emotions from the past, right?
Yes, indeed. I mean, what we're seeing, Ara, is it is a complete reckoning of centuries and decades of a disregard for Black lives, particularly by law enforcement and by the government. And we've been fighting these systems of institutional racism, of systemic racism for decades and centuries. And for some reason, we keep telling this story. We keep saying that this is a huge problem, and we're watching people die, and too many people are dying. Too many Black people, in particular, are dying at the hands of law enforcement, and in many instances, they are unarmed. So, what we're seeing is decades of injustice.
Barbara, you mentioned institutional racism, and I'm going to come back to that in just a moment. But first, I want to talk about this in a little bit more detail because we have seen an unnecessary death of an African American individual by law enforcement just too many times. Eric Garner, Breonna Taylor, Philando Castile are some of the names that we have heard about in the media. But data tells us that over 2,000 African American men and women have been killed by the police since 2014. Why does this keep happening? And why did George Floyd's death all of a sudden inspire such an uprising?
Well, one thing that we've seen as a consistent pattern, Ara, is that there are poor systems of accountability within these police departments. We've seen it time and time again. Unfortunately, people have to die when officers are engaged in behavior that we know, the public knows, oftentimes is illegal and outside of department guidelines, and it results in a death. And we've seen officers either being acquitted, not held accountable, time and time again. And it's indicative of changes that need to be made in these agencies where we can see more accountability. And there are statistics that consistently show that Black people, African Americans, are 3 to 5 times more likely to die as a result of an interaction with police. And we've seen this over and over again. So this cry for justice and this cry for accountability has been something that we have been talking about for decades. And I really believe at the core, at the center of these reoccurrences is poor accountability for police agencies and police departments that need to be reconciled.
Barbara, thank you. You've talked about institutional racism, poor system of accountability, systemic racism. Can you take a little bit of time, please, and explain institutional racism versus systemic racism?
Sure. So when we talk about institutional racism, in general, we're talking about a particular group that's being treated differently. And throughout our history, we know that there have been these ideas of white superiority that are captured in everyday thinking at the systems level in these organizations. So when we talk about institutional racism, we're talking about practices and policies within institutions that favor white people and disfavor people of color. And we see that playing out in who's more likely to get a promotion, who's more likely to be treated indifferently. And that comes from a long history of discrimination. And when we talk about systemic racism, we're talking about structural practices or systems in society that have the same outcomes of favoring white people, and the impact is seen throughout major systems in society. So we can look at the criminal justice system and we see that we have continued racialized outcomes that favor white people and disfavor people of color. We can look at our healthcare systems in this country and we see disparities that are racially uh, driven. We also see in our education system. So in most systems in society, when we say systemic racism, we see that there are racialized outcomes that continue to favor whites and disfavor people of color. More, mostly we see with Black people.
Thank you, Barbara. That's a helpful delineation of how racism is embedded in our society, in our institutions, in our systems. And for me, it begs the question of how does our country's history factor into these institutional and systemic racist situations that we have and the events that continue to arise in our country. Can you tell us about the history and how it all factors into it?
Sure. You know, we here in the United States of America have a long history of sanctioned racism. We saw that played out with American slavery, where enslaved Africans and Black people were subject to not only state violence, but many other acts of discrimination for centuries. We have a history of policing here that is traced back to slave patrols. So some of the early police agencies were originated from slave patrols, and their number one purpose was to capture slaves, enslaved Black people. We know that there's a brutal history of lynching here in this country for centuries that we are still trying to reconcile. And some of that, as we see being played out now, is almost, it's refused to being laid to rest. We still see that. So we talk about a history of lynching in this country. Now we're calling it neo-lynching because we're seeing a lot of that happen today. And unfortunately, sometimes we are the only folks who are being trained to forget about it, to forget about this history. And it is important to keep telling the story because we still are fighting for freedom and equality. And in some spaces, it seems like it's an illusion. And we see a lot of that playing out today with some of these protests that we're seeing around the world happening. So our history is very rich. There has been, and when we talk about a system where there is no accountability for police, you know, in essence, that is state and government sanctioned violence. You know, and we've seen that, and we've seen that in our history, and we have a long standing history with no accountability to sanctioned lethal and violent practices against African Americans in this country, and we're still contending with that. There's stereotypes of Blackness that still exist that we contend with every single day. So it's embedded in most of our institutions, in our society, and how we practice interacting with each other here in this country.
Barbara, that's very insightful and very rich information. And I wonder if we can take a moment to perhaps bring what you've said to life with an actual example. I think about Emmett Till, a 14-year-old kid who went to visit his family in the South in 1955 and died a horrible death. And his mother chose to do an open casket funeral. Talk a little bit more about that event and how it feeds into the stereotypes of Blackness and the law enforcement lack of appropriate action or really horrible action, in fact.
Wow. I mean, you know, the Emmett Till story, Ara, is still pretty chilling, still difficult to talk about. It is still one of the reasons why I have a different prayer for my nephews than I do my niece, but I'll come back to that. So in the Emmett Till case, historically, A 14-year-old Black young man, for those of you that are familiar with that story, was murdered and lynched because he was looking at a white woman in a way that was not acceptable. And that was the rumor. And he learned subsequently that a lot of that wasn't even true, but he was brutalized. It is such a mark in our history how Black men are looked at and viewed and treated. And his mother wanted the world to see in 1955 what happened to her young teenage son for being accused of looking at a white woman. Now, a lot of that historically comes from this notion, this symbolism of the Black male rapist, the Black male who is seen as inherently violent, inherently sexualized, and inherently criminal. And that tied into a lot of the history of lynching that I talked about earlier. So that is embedded in part of American history and part of American society and American psyche, that there is this symbolism that is attached to Black men who are violent and who are rapists, and they are also seen as less than human. So there's this inherent and this natural inclination to respond to that in ways that are often violent, ways that are often unfair. And I pause because when you think about it, there are a lot of Black women who fear for their sons and their husbands and their brothers and their friends to actually go out in the world because of this symbolism. They are seen and targeted as they are those violent Black males, those violent rapists. And oftentimes they don't come back home. And we've seen that. So, the Emmett Till story, and, God bless his mother and other mothers that, that are still contending with this and having different prayers for their sons than they do their daughters. It comes from something that has been embedded in our history for many, many centuries and decades. We're still dealing with that today.
Barbara, Emmett Till was killed 65 years ago. And so many, too many incidents like that have happened in our country since then. There's no wonder that we have such mistrust between communities of color and law enforcement. How do you explain all that?
Well, one of the challenges is on an everyday basis, because we're still dealing with institutional racism, systemic racism. On a daily basis, we have Black people and oftentimes, other people of color who are racially profiled by the police. I'm a Black woman. I experience racism on, I would say, somewhat of a daily basis as well. I know what systemic racism is. I know what those incidents are. I know what it is to be racially profiled. And one thing that is challenging for us as we go forward in answering this question is it's very difficult to trust an agency that is expected to protect and serve, and your tax dollars go towards that expectation, to then wonder if you're going to get home safely because you're being profiled based on systemic racism. There's a culture of racism that still exists. So it's difficult. And I can't speak for all Black people in all communities, but I can say that because of everyday, ordinary injustices that happen to Black people in particular by police agencies and police officers, and most of those practices are illegal because racial profiling is illegal. And it's difficult to trust. So many of us, and I can speak for myself, I am lucky and blessed to be alive because I could have been Sandra Bland. I do question police when I'm profiled and when I'm stopped, and that's happened to me. So we're working on trying to be trustful, but it's very, very difficult. Our main number one goal is to get home safely and travel the world without being mistreated based on our race.
Barbara, I am grateful you're alive too. But this outright racism, we just saw, well, didn't see, but read about this just this morning. I was reading about an incident in Wilmington where the police chief disclosed that 3 officers were caught on camera blatantly saying that they were going to go out there and use, and very inappropriate word, find Black people that they were going to kill. You know all this, you knew all this, and you became a police officer. Why did you choose to become a police officer, and what was it like to be a member of the elite New York Police Department?
No, thank you. Thank you for that question. And I am still asked to this very day, what were you thinking? Why did you, how was your experience? So, it's a timely question. Well, one reason why I joined the police department is because I grew up in New York City in the 70s, and I witnessed growing up police brutality up close and personal in my community, in my neighborhoods. And although we wanted to trust the police and appreciated the police in our neighborhoods, we also saw a side of police brutality that was unnecessary and uncalled for. So I thought my 23-year-old rose-colored glasses self thought that I would join the police department and get rid of the bad cops, make a difference. I was going to save the NYPD, the largest police department in the country. I was going to go in and do all these great things. So I thought that I would go in and make a difference. Then I also was recruited during that time because they wanted to do some gang infiltration. And I was recruited to join the police to help with some of that work. Although that didn't work out, it took a whole year for me to be hired with the police department after I was recruited. But essentially, I thought I would go in and make a difference. And I found out early on that the racism that I was seeing, that I saw happening in my communities with police brutality, there was also a level of racism that I experienced within the police department as a Black woman officer. So again, a lot of my work was about how can I, in my own way, try to make some difference in this work. But my original goal was to go in and not only serve, but I was really motivated by going in to try to weed out, if I could in some way, had no idea, bad police officers.
You were within and still could not affect the kind of change you had hoped for. And so many people have been trying to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like it just has not paid off. Is that why there's so much anger?
Well, I mean, there's all sorts of reasons why there's so much anger, but I do know that police culture, and as I said earlier, Ara, we're talking about a system that was designed to oppress certain people. It was not welcoming to certain people. We talk about the history of policing, slave patrols. It was about continuing the system of racism. But as far as people going on the inside and trying to do the work, one of the challenges is police culture and just culture. So, all organizations have a culture. Guilford College has a culture, but something about the police culture is you learn early on, it is an us versus them culture. You learn early on that it is about making sure that you are first and foremost loyal to your brothers and sisters in the police department. So it was difficult and sometimes dangerous to speak out, as it is today in organizations. We know we even have policies for whistleblowers, so to speak. And a lot of that has to do with not being one who wants to speak out against your brothers and sisters in blue. So it was challenging, and it still is challenging to call out. But one thing that I am so grateful for that I see now happening as a result of what's playing out on the world stage that I did not see happening when I was a police officer was police officers now are actually breaking rank. They are standing in solidarity with protesters. When I was a police officer in the mid 80s, and we were part of a lot of these protests, we were on the other side of the police barricade. And you were told you had to stay as a police officer on that side of the barricade. You could not join the protesters. And I remember watching teardrops rolling down the faces of some of the Black officers who were on the other side of the barricade, including myself, when we wanted to stand in solidarity with protesters. And in those cases, they were similar to what's happening today. Police brutality. Another Black person lost their lives, and we could not break rank. And today, it moves my heart in ways, Ara, that I can't even express right now, to see that police officers are able to break rank, stand united, as we've seen on the news, to stand against police brutality. Now, that is something that is unheard of.
It really is quite remarkable to see our society changing right in front of our eyes in a good way, in a better way, finally. Barbara, earlier you talked about how Black mothers are afraid to send out their Black sons into the world. Black women are worried about their husbands and nephews and brothers going out into the world because of the dangers that they face, that you have a special prayer for your nephews. And for me, that brings up my next question. Trayvon Martin in 2013, just this kid went out with a hoodie, that's all, and ended up getting chased by George Zimmerman, and he was on the phone with his girlfriend, and the whole thing kind of got recorded as he was literally chased to get murdered. And came out of that, and then Michael Brown's death, Black Lives Matter. And Black Lives Matter appears to be so misunderstood. Can you tell us about Black Lives Matter, why it started and what it means?
Yeah, an organization near and dear to my heart, of course. But as you say, Black Lives Matter did start. Three Black women started the Black Lives Matter movement as a result of George Zimmerman being acquitted for the Trayvon Martin case. And we had seen other instances of young Black men being killed by the police. And these three women started a movement to fight these injustices and other violent acts from the state against young Black people or Black people in general. And they have, as a result of starting this movement, for everyone to come together and do something about these injustices against Black people by state agencies, is now a global movement. I mean, there are 40 chapters that are all over the world, and their main focus is how can we address some of these injustices that are steeped in racism. And it's not only about police brutality, it is about economic inequality in communities. It is about social justice on most levels that that need to be addressed in communities of color. So this notion that the Black Lives Matter movement is some terrorist organization is not true at all, because one thing we don't see, we do not see violence. We do not see Black people now rising up, okay, as a group of people, either in this country or in any other country, attacking and killing white people in particular. We don't see that. We are still teaching love and justice. We're not doing that. So to say that an organization that is about social justice and is about addressing racism, that we see the impact of racism that we see happening all over the country every single day, to say that they are a terrorist organization is nothing different than what we've seen happening with the resistance to people over the decades and over the centuries who have been trying to fight this war against racism. So they have to be discredited if the system, right, the dominant system is going to survive. And we've seen that before. So a wonderful organization that started with these three Black women now is a global movement for social justice. And it's unfortunate that they are deemed negatively and are, you know, depicted as some type of threat when they are doing incredible work.
Incredible work indeed. I love seeing that there are cities that are having Black Lives Matter painted on their streets, and that there has been such a movement, especially recently on social media, people using Black Lives Matter for their profile pictures and so on. So there's clearly more and more understanding and empathy with this movement, and yet there are some people out there who still ask about, well, how about all lives? Don't they matter? Can you tell us why Black Lives Matter does not mean all lives don't matter?
Sure, absolutely. So one of the things that we've heard over and over again is all lives matter, to dismiss the Black Lives Matter notion. And what is behind Black Lives Matter is that historically, Black lives have been seen and considered as being less than white lives. We know early on, centuries ago, that it was even written into the Constitution that Black people were 3/5 of a human being. So it goes back centuries. And we have seen that there have been laws and policies that have, in fact, been implemented to emphasize that very fact, that Black lives are valued less. Black people could have been killed publicly back in colonial America. There are statutes that we can review today that show that it was okay for a white person to kill a Black person. It was okay for a white person to rip the clothes off of a Black slave if they did not look like slave clothing. It was okay for a Black person to be whipped or killed publicly if they looked at a white person differently. So there's always been something that's embedded in American society and through government policies that Black lives and Black people are valued differently. And so when we say Black lives matter, we mean they do matter, and they should be valued the same as white lives are valued. And we see over and over and over again, time and time and time again, how and when that is not the case. We are still trying to reconcile with a lot of these racialized outcomes that we see in most institutions of our society, where Black lives are being affected much worse than white lives. So when we talk about the disproportionality of statistics and the impact of these systems that I mentioned earlier, we usually see Black lives and Black people at the top of those statistics. So when we say Black Lives Matter, we're talking about how we need to make sure that in the context of structural inequality, in the context of systemic racism, Black lives do matter and should matter. And therefore, if they did matter to the same degree that white lives matter, maybe we would see different data. The racialized outcomes would be different. So of course, all lives matter. But when we say Black lives matter, we are reminding society and the world that racial narrative about Black people is wrong, and it needs to change, and it's still impacting lives and communities.
Barbara, you would think that humanity, decency, and civility would be at the heart of all of this, so that people would not ever have to question whether Black lives matter or not. But unfortunately, that appears not to have been enough, and therefore we need to have a better way of educating and informing our society. And so I'm switching gears just a little bit here then to talk about Guilford College's Justice and Policy Studies Department. Can you tell us how you and our other faculty colleagues have gone about designing the curriculum in the JPS department?
Happily. I couldn't wait for this question. So one thing that is really wonderful about our JPS department is the faculty is so diverse. So we have professors who are JDs, attorneys, we have PhDs, we have professors who have master's degrees in public administration, public affairs, forensic psychology. We also have professors who have MDivs, Masters of Divinities. And we know when we talk about race and crime and community injustice, we have to talk about it from an interdisciplinary perspective. So the diversity in the faculty really helps. And I am one who is a huge proponent of some of your best professors, no matter what college or university you're in, are those who not only have educational experience and scholarship and background, but those who actually have experience in the field in which they're teaching. So we see a lot of that, and I think that brings a lot of strength to the JPS department. Some of the courses that we have designed in the JPS program, we have community and justice studies and a criminal justice track. We teach signature courses, and I call them signature courses because they deal with exactly what you and I have been talking about on this call. So we have a course called Race, Society, and Criminal Justice, where we talk about race and crime, and we talk about the history of race, and we talk about that from a psychological perspective. We talk about it from a sociological perspective as we talk about race and crime. We have a course called Miscarriages of Justice, Police Brutality, Understanding Oppressive Systems, Community Problem Solving. And in each of those courses, we want our students to have the broadest context and understanding of here is the history of these systems, here are some of the problems that need to be addressed. And many of these students are planning to go and work for these agencies and these systems. And we want them to have the analysis. We want them to know that when you go in, you need to understand why these agencies were built, who they were built for, and what changes need to take place in order for them to be more effective. And how can you, as a student, as a Guilford College student, who is a JPS student, who's in the criminal justice department, major or community justice studies major, what analysis are you taking to that field as a professional? And we take pride in that. We have some wonderful courses. We've had students that have worked based on our course design who are actually out in communities doing work, coming back. How does it apply to what you're learning in the classroom, the experiences in these organizations? What are you learning, and how can we take all this scholarship and use it so that we can help organizations see things from not only a historical perspective, but a psychological perspective in ways that we can help have our students, our graduates, go out and affect change in these agencies. So I'm very, very excited about the work that comes out of the JPS department. We have a signature master's program in criminal justice, and we have our students that have some of that background, and it is part of the analysis, it's part of the core curriculum, having these historical perspectives and looking at these systems and training and educating students to go out into the world and hopefully make change. And we have some excellent results with some of our alums. I mean, we have an alum, Dina Hayes. She's a graduate of Guilford College's Community and Justice Studies program, and she co-founded a premier racial equity institute. She also serves on the Guilford County School Board. We have someone who was just named the executive director of a high-profile nonprofit organization here in Greensboro that is doing this work that we're talking about. So I think kudos to the JPS department. We hope that other departments at other colleges and universities can do what we do. These are the type of faculty that we want to have on our staff, and we also want to make sure that our students are getting a rich education because we want them to go in and be change agents and also educate others.
Barbara, thank you. This is really where that values-based education comes into play. These core values of Guilford College: community, diversity, excellence, equality, justice, integrity, and stewardship being put into the curriculum, and then our students, our alumni, go into the world and make it a better place because that's the kind of education they got. For the sake of time, I'm going to kind of skip forward to the next or the last question for you, and then we're going to go into some audience questions. You co-founded the Wiser Justice program, and it was made possible through some financial philanthropic support from the Center for Principled Problem Solving at Guilford College. Can you tell us about the Wiser Justice program, how it was inspired, how it came to be, and how restorative justice, this concept we hear about, restorative justice, how does that play into this excellent program that you co-founded?
Sure, absolutely. So those wonderful courses that I just described, we were teaching those courses. So I'll just give you two examples. It was inspired by a student who was taking one of these courses, and her name is Tiffany Cowan, and she's still doing great things in the world. But she was in my race and criminal justice class, and I was on one of my rants about the war on drugs and the impact that it's having on communities. And if we continue to have these regressive policies that is sending college age individuals to prison, then we need to bring prison to them. She was also a student in another class called Power, Politics, and Schools. And in that course, again, similar to what I described, the course talks about the school to prison pipeline and what's happening in our society with all of these systems that is tracking students and young people to prison as opposed to college. So she was inspired, and she asked me to help start Guilford College bringing college to prisons. And from there, I mean, it's a long story, but it was inspired by a student. And we were able to bring members from very elite prison education programs, Bard, Max Kenner, and Sean Pika, people who are part of College Behind Bars, who started a lot of things, and they came to Guilford College. They helped us get started. Tiffany and I went out to San Quentin and visited a program. So it took us a few years to put it together, but we are now proud to say that we've had the Wiser Justice program where we offer college courses to folks who are incarcerated in 3 facilities. So they get 30 college credits, and they also get an employment credential as part of that program. But it's also Guilford College's, one of our core values is equality and justice. And it is our public display of how we are giving back to the community. And we care about the impact of mass incarceration. And we want people to have the tools to go out and not only be successful, but we also want them to be able to impact change. And by far, a lot of our students in the Wiser Justice program are, when they complete the program and we do our exit interviews, we ask them, what is it that you want to do with this education and these credentials? And by far, one of the most popular responses is, I want to give back to my community. I want to restore. I want to go back and do some good things. I want to re-engage with my community in ways that I wasn't able to before. So the outcomes that we are seeing are wonderful, and we need to continue with programs like the Wiser Justice program, but definitely inspired by a student who was in the JPS program.
Barbara, thank you. Thank goodness for you and Tiffany and Dan and Beth Mosca for founding the Center for Principled Problem Solving at Guilford, and all this effort that has gone on. I'm going to ask you some audience questions now. We are just about at that point, about 15 minutes before the end of our program. Topaz, a 2010 graduate of Guilford College in Greensboro, asks a question that I will tag along with that, a question from Terry in Chapel Hill. Topaz asks, how do we reform the police after such a long history of protecting officers? And Terry asks, how can we as a society create accountability for police departments?
You know, great question, Topaz and Terry. And we see some of that playing out. So if you're paying attention to what's happening, we are seeing police officers being charged so quickly now. We haven't seen that before. So one of the challenges is, how do we actually implement policies that can change police behavior? So I would say we have to have these collective voices that we see. We have to have the participation of legislators. We have to have city council members. We have to have the community working together to actually reform and transform police departments. We have to have legislation and policies that actually make it not only illegal for police officers to engage in certain behaviors, but they have to be removed from the profession. And I liken it to, if you think about banking, in the financial industry, if you work as a bank teller and you steal money and you're caught stealing money on camera or whatever it is, the first thing that happens to the bank teller is that they're fired. And oftentimes they are not allowed to work in the financial industry. One of the things that we have to do with police reform and police accountability is that we have to have a system that has enough leverage to remove police officers when they engage in illegal activity and police brutality. What we've seen is a history of this lack of accountability, where you'll see that officers who have several and many complaints are still being sent out on patrol. And oftentimes, particularly in the George Floyd case, those of you on the call, if you've been watching this, Terry and Topaz, Chauvin, the one who was leaning on George Floyd's neck, had a history of 17 complaints. And we've seen that. And that is not uncommon. So what we have to do is figure out how we can implement policies that will control behavior. Also, training. We have to have more implicit bias training. We have to continue to work on those stereotypes, addressing those stereotypes that turn into action that folks are experiencing every single day. So it's going to take policy, legislation. It's going to take courageousness on these police departments as they change and look at their training and their hiring policies. And it needs to be something that is ongoing, because there are too many deaths, and the communities will continue to be up in arms about it. I hope that was helpful.
Very helpful. Thank you, Barbara. Monique in Greensboro asks a question that is particularly relevant for you to answer, because you were a trainer in the New York City Police Department. And Monique wants to know, why do we just have 12 weeks of training when training for police officers in many other countries is about 2 years long? And how does that factor into what we experience in the United States as a result with deaths by police officers?
Monique, that is a great question. And there is so much scholarship out there that talks about this very issue. And it shows the data in the longer police officers are trained, the more education they have, you will have fewer incidents of violations of their patrol guides, as well as fatalities based on police action shootings and interactions with the public. Now, one reason I think, and I'm not totally sure, is funding. A lot of times in the United States, we have, there is X amount of dollars that's put into training. You might have a police department that has a large budget, but in many instances, the budget for the training is not nearly as extensive as it is in other areas. So I think funding and finances is a big part of it. And I also think that the focus of the training needs to be expanded. So if the average amount of time that a police officer in police academies in the US are trained is 5 months to 6 months, 3 to 5 months. And then most of that training has to do with firearms training, has to do with tactical safety, and has to do with enforcement. And the smaller portion of the training has to do with cultural accountability and sensitivity. And as we know, much of that training is even more important for police officers than tactical training, because the average police officer does not really engage in using their firearm. Usually there are calls for service. And when I spoke earlier about racial profiling still being problematic, a lot of it is communication. And I believe, Monique, that that is something that may in fact help. I think it actually will help if we had more training dedicated to cultural accountability, police accountability for recruits in police agencies and training academies than tactical firearms training, because it's not that often that police are actually using their firearms. So I think it would serve well, but a lot of that is tied up with funding and finances and the focus. It's a really good question, and there's lots of good scholarship on that. And I believe more training in the areas that I just mentioned will in fact decrease a lot of these incidents that we see. Officers will be able to learn more about different cultures, different groups, and they will see them differently, hopefully, and that they will also engage with them differently because they have more education. And then it will also give them some background on some of our history of stereotypes and why that has been problematic. And I am a proponent of more training, enhanced training, and certainly cultural sensitivity.
Barbara, we have time for just one more question, maybe a couple of minutes or so for another question before we close. And I do see some other questions in the chat from Andy, Joanne, Belan, and Gary, and we will get those answers for you after the program. The last question I'm going to ask you before we wrap up is from Topaz again. And this is a very heartfelt, very deep question. Topaz asks, why do white people hate, dislike, misunderstand Black people so much to the point they feel that it is okay to interfere with our daily activities, such as walking the dog, sleeping in a dorm lounge, selling bottled water, and having a cookout in the park?
Wow. Thanks for that question. Topaz, I mean, I think it's tough to say that, there is a hate that exists, with everyday ordinary white people. But I will say this, and I mentioned it earlier, we have been taught and socialized and primed to think of Black people as being less than human. And I mentioned some of that earlier. I mean, and the evolution of that is systemic racism and institutional racism that we experience. So for decades, for centuries, there's been this notion and this idea that Black people are less than. They are to be feared. They are to be sometimes hated and despised. And we saw a lot of that happening in colonial America, where there were statutes that allowed for a lot of these behaviors towards Black people. And we learned that even some of the manifestations of that today shows up in what we call racial hoaxes. In a racial hoax is when someone says that a crime was committed by someone of another race, when in fact the crime didn't happen in the first place. So we look at Susan Smith. We look at an incident that recently happened in New York City where a white woman called the police on a Black man, and he was walking his dog. And we've seen instances where, just as you described in your question, where it seems as if there is this dislike or this hate towards Black people coming from white people. What I will say is that we have not done a good job at educating our citizens in this country on some of that history and where that comes from, and how we still need to work hard at dispelling a lot of those myths, and how we need to work at dismantling a lot of these systems of racism that continue to perpetuate a lot of these stereotypes. And it makes it difficult for us to live together in harmony. So it's understandable that little girls, and we've seen this in studies, little girls and boys, how they have this notion that being white, thinking of white people in a way that's more favorable than they do thinking about black people. And we've seen that in the doll study. We've seen that in different iterations of training and studies as to why there's this psychological thought that there is white superiority and black inferiority. And we can look at our history. So a lot of it comes from how we've been trained. A lot of it comes from how we have lived in this society that was started, in fact, with genocide and racism in ways that have been embedded in most institutions of our society. So it's a long history, and these are just practices, common practices that unfortunately we have to still deal with today. And it doesn't really bring us together. Sometimes it brings us apart. But I still say love wins over hate. And we still teach our children to love. And we need all of us to come together and do that. And we see that playing out with these protests all over the world. So now, similar to what happened in the 1960s with the civil rights movement, we saw a collective effort of not only black people, white people, but all people. But now we see in this revolutionary moment that there are young black and white and brown and red people who are part of this movement now, so that we can make a change in this world and stop a lot of these unnecessary killings and a lot of these injustices that we see happening, in particular to black people, but black and brown people.
Barbara, thank you. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." What are some last words you want to leave our audience with in terms of where we go from here?
Yeah, certainly. We have to keep telling the story. It was a 17-year-old woman who filmed the George Floyd murder. We have young people now that are charged. So we have to keep telling this story about racism, and we have to keep fighting for justice, and we have to come together to let the world know that this is not a way that we need to exist as a world and as a community. So we need to start with our own organizations, start with our own schools, work on institutional racism, work on those practices and policies that you have in place that continue to disfavor people of color. We need to work on addressing some of those racialized outcomes that are problematic for communities of color. So you have to get in touch with your legislators if we're talking about police reform. We're talking about transforming the criminal justice system. We have to be civically engaged, and we have to, in our daily lives, interrupt if you can. Speak out for folks who are experiencing some type of racism, some type of hateful act, so that we can continue to come together. But I do believe, and I see change. I see things happening now on the world stage that we have not seen. So I am encouraged. And I believe that what we have to keep doing is we have to keep fighting for justice. We have to keep working together, and we have to let people know that Black lives do matter. And we should not be okay with continued deaths of Black and brown people at the hands of the police, particularly when it is unnecessary and when it is unwarranted. And we have to love over hate.
Barbara, thank you. We are not mere bystanders. We are people that can and must affect change around us. I am encouraged that we have members of our faculty and staff today. We have our alumni here with us today. We have trustees. We have parents of students, parents of alumni, parents of faculty with us on this program today. I'm encouraged by that, by all of that, because I know that these Guilfordians will do in fact that and go and affect positive change in the communities in which we live. Thank you all for joining us. A survey and link to the video will be forthcoming by email. Our next program, last Thursday of the month coffee chat for July, will be on July 30th. In the meantime, I'm so honored to work with you, Barbara Lawrence. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.